sometimes we can become frustrated or discouraged with our progress along the path. The potential for getting to an end of it all, an awakening if you like, seems so far away and perhaps not even possible at all. And what we're going to do in today's video is look at the possibility of partial awakening and how that can be both helpful to us, and then later on we'll look at the end of the video towards what the Buddha had to say, because he had some rather interesting things to say about the potential for a partial awakening. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos, ring the bell down below. And if you'd like to get a deeper dive into elements of the early Buddhist Dharma, which I discuss on this channel, check out the courses that I have at onlinedharma.org. Is it possible to become completely without craving, to become completely without greed and hatred and delusion, to find an end of dukkha, or our sense of unsatisfactoriness with life? This is what it would be to attain awakening, and it seems very, very far away, I think, for most all of us. And I think this frustration at times, this difficulty at times that we can see with Buddhist practice is abetted by our own tendencies towards self-deprecation, towards self-criticism, towards self-blame at times. That we feel that we're not really up to the project, that there's no way we could get anywhere close to that end. And I must admit to being very much in that kind of camp, where I tend to be very self-critical, and I tend to look at the downsides of lots of things rather than looking at their upsides sometimes. And that can sometimes lead towards a kind of blockage, a kind of feeling like we're not really getting anywhere. So we often look at all the ways that we may fall short in our practice. And as I say, I do the same thing, where even if I've had a relatively good day, even a great day, if there's some time when I find myself getting angry with somebody, perhaps on the phone, or something goes wrong in the store and I get frustrated, that can seem to loom large if we're taking an overlook at our day at the end of the day, if we're doing a kind of meditation on those kinds of things. Then even a few moments of anger or a few moments of greed can tend to loom large. And this, of course, is a good spur to practice, but it can also be a problem for us if we give it too much play in our lives. So one thing that we should do, I think, in practice is to make a point of looking back upon our good behavior, looking back on the kinds of things that make us kind people, to look back on our kindness and our compassion for others, because that can also be a spur to practice, especially for many of us, as I say, who tend to be self-critical. Spending time looking at the ways in which you don't need to criticize yourself because you're doing well can give you confidence on the path. And indeed, this is one of the things that the Buddha talked about, is that it's part of good practice. You should praise yourself for the good things that you do. This is part of good practice. But it's also, I think, part of good practice, and one thing that we're going to be talking about in this video more, is to pay attention to those times that seem closer to awakening in some ways, where we're able to relax around things that we normally grasp to. And this is, I would say, somewhat deeper than the issue of being just a kind and nice person, important though those of course are. This involves an awareness of our mind being willing to disengage with our grasping on the world, disengage with our identification with the world. And this sort of experience may last only a moment or a few moments, a relative dropping away of our grasping. This kind of momentary like awakening, something like an awakening state just for a moment. And I mean, I remember, I'll talk something relatively recent. I remember going through a period where I really wanted a nice Japanese knife for cutting vegetables because, well, it's not something I needed. It's still not something I need, but it was like they're beautiful Japanese knives. They seem so well made, and it seems like something I would really love to have and use. And so I went through a period of sort of looking at Japanese knives on the internet, and which one would I like, all these different kinds, different prices. And I spent several weeks, we might even say several months, just sort of looking at them from time to time. But I resisted buying anything, and I find that now it's a few months after that, and that desire for this Japanese knife for cutting vegetables has sort of waned away. I don't really have it anymore. Which isn't to say I wouldn't enjoy to have a Japanese knife, but it's not something that I crave right now. And so I notice in myself how this craving that I had for a time has lessened, has dropped away. And I think that's the kind of thing that we can look at in our practice, but also in our daily life, to be an indicator of an opening towards a kind of awakening. That we relax around things that we thought we really wanted and needed, but in fact we really don't need. And sometimes this happens in formal meditation. That is, that when we're sitting on the cushion in mindfulness meditation, we may be aware of the arising of certain kinds of desires, or even anger in certain ways. But that we may find that as we sit with these kinds of feelings, and as we perhaps become aware of their causes and conditions, the kinds of things that brought them into being, as we become aware of perhaps their unimportance in the present moment, because oftentimes these things are completely unimportant in the present moment when we're doing the meditation, we can feel them simply fall away. We can simply let them be, and they just sort of disappear. And so we can have this kind of feeling of something like a temporary, momentary kind of awakened state where the stress involved with these kinds of emotional states evaporates. We no longer feel the stress. We no longer feel the anxiety that's bound up in these kinds of states. And we can feel a kind of freedom in that moment. Oftentimes I find that metta meditation, loving kindness meditation, can even be helpful here in this regard. Because oftentimes I think the stresses and anxieties built up in cravings seem to sort of melt away when we think in a kind fashion towards the world. I don't know exactly how this happens, but it seems to happen. The kindness sort of, if we try to foster kindness within ourselves, the anxieties tend to sort of lessen on their own. It's sort of a way in which I would say meditation, metta or loving kindness meditation is kind of like a sun melting the kind of ice that is our normal anxieties of greed and hatred. So try that for yourself. It may be helpful to you under certain circumstances, but not always. So, but from here I would like to turn now to see what the Buddha had to say about partial awakening, the potential for partial awakening in one sutta. So we'll turn to that now. There are a number of suttas where the Buddha discusses with his monastics that after his own passing, that they should be islands and refuges unto themselves. And there are a number of suttas also where he goes on to explain what that entails. In one of these suttas, what the Buddha does is to talk about, he tells them, so he says to them basically, what does it mean to be an island and refuge unto yourself? Well, what he says is that to do that, that the practice that you should undertake is to sit with and get to know this feeling of dukkha, of unsatisfactoriness. And once you get to know it, to try to find out where it comes from. Because if you can find the source of this unsatisfactoriness, of this dukkha, of this suffering, as it's sometimes translated, if you can find its source, then you can work most efficiently and appropriately on trying to get rid of it. And so the Buddha asks them to do that. He says, this should be your practice. And then the Buddha goes on to say that if you do this practice, if you sit with this suffering or this dukkha within yourself, and if you try to investigate where it comes from, the Buddha suggests that one place that you will find this is that the suffering seems to arise from our tendency to identify ourselves with parts of the world, with parts of our experience. That we tend to identify ourselves as, we tend to think of them as ours, as things that belong to us, as things over which we have control. And if we do this, then as the world changes, as we change, in ways that are in fact not controllable, we will find suffering arising. And so he says that we will, many of us will identify ourselves with, let's say, our own bodies. This is one typical way that we will identify ourselves. Or we will identify ourselves with our own perceptions, our own ability to perceive, or the way that we perceive the world. We'll identify ourselves with our consciousness. This is one typical way in the ancient texts that people would identify themselves. Or with our volition, our ability to do things in the world, with our activity in the world. These are other ways that we can identify ourselves. Now, there are many others, of course, as well. But he says that if we do this, we're going to tend to see suffering arise, insofar as we identify ourselves with one of these or another particular thing. And of course, when it comes to physical form, which is one of these ways that we can identify ourselves, we can identify ourselves with our bodies or with objects in the world, with our houses, with our possessions, with our cars, with our bank accounts, whatever. So there's many ways that we can do this, an infinite number of ways, really. But what he says is that insofar as we can see the arising and falling of these things, let's just take form as an example, insofar as we can see the arising and decaying of form, insofar as we can see the change of form and come to know that, then we begin to relax around our tendency to grasp that as who we are, as mine, as something that we can control. So for example, if we begin to see this in our own bodies, then we become less anxious, less stressed over changes that inevitably happen to our bodies as we get older. When we're young, we sort of don't realize this. But when you get to, in my own case, I can say when you get to about 40, and that's even maybe a little bit old for some people, but at least when you get to 40, you begin to see that things are not reacting as well as they would 10 years earlier, 20 years earlier in the body. And that's only going to accelerate. So it takes an ability to sit with these and see the change, to try to begin to relax around that. If we can see these changes with wisdom, with insight, then we will tend to relax. And the Buddha says that a monastic, he's talking to his monastics, but it could be anybody who is able to see this, let's say, in our example, with regard to form, with regard to our bodies, somebody who's able to see this, he says, is extinguished in that respect. And the Pali term is an odd one, but the term is TADANGANIBBUTO. That is, Nibbuto is a word that's cognate to nirvana, to nibbana, to awakening, or to extinguishment. And Tadanga means in that way. So he is extinguished in that way. That is, somebody who ceases to cling to form. Let's take, again, the case of our bodies. Somebody who ceases to cling to their bodies as who they are, then relaxes around that, then ceases to have anxiety and stress around their bodies. And as a result is, if you like, awakened with respect to the body. They're extinguished in that respect. At least that's the way the Buddha puts it in this sutta. Now, they may not be awakened with respect to other features of themselves or the world. Indeed, in the context here, they clearly aren't. They're not awakened yet. So we could call it or consider it a kind of a partial awakening. That is, other things may stress them out. They may identify themselves with other parts of the world or other parts of their own anatomy, or I should say their own mental anatomy, let's say their volitions or something else. They may identify themselves with any number of things, but they're not identifying themselves with this thing, which tends to, in that respect, reduce their stress and anxiety, reduce their sense of dukkha, of suffering. And now it's not clear from this sutta whether this kind of partial awakening is temporary, or whether the Buddha might have considered it permanent in certain circumstances. I would tend to doubt that, but I really don't know. It's not clear from the, as I say, it's not clear from the way the sutta goes. But we don't find, in my knowledge, a lot of other places in the early texts where this kind of thing is discussed. So my hypothesis would be that it's probably temporary. Because I know, well, I should say it's probably temporary in the sense that they will release their craving for their body, they'll release identification for their body for a time, but it might come back because they're not fully awakened yet. Now, I would say that from my own experience, these kinds of partial awakenings, if you like, or these tendencies to notice a flash of relaxation, of calm in all of our experience, all of my experience, these tend to come and go. That is to say, they'll go away for a time and you feel quite relaxed. Maybe you've had this experience yourself. But then when you get back into daily life creeps back into you, and the same worries tend to come up again. They may not come up quite as large, maybe, depending on the case, but at least you're not out of the woods yet. So one of my teachers talks about being aware of these kinds of events as being important to the path, these little tastes of awakening. And indeed, in the suttas on mindfulness meditation, the Buddha talks about part of the way that we should be mindful is to be mindful of when these kinds of states arise, when we feel as though we're getting close to a kind of a momentary awakened state, when we feel a pleasure, a happiness, or a kind of a good, a beneficial state that arises from being willing to let go at least for a moment, being willing to let things be for a moment. That itself is a real benefit, I think, within meditation, something that we should practice towards. But to do this, I think it does help to be aware of the different ways that we can identify ourselves with aspects of our own experience or our own minds, because these are typically the way that we do this. And I have an earlier video where I talk about 5 ways that we identify ourselves with our own experience. And so I think that video will be very helpful for you to give you an idea of some of the ways that you may be doing that. So I'll put up a link to it here on the screen. You can see it right now. And I would suggest taking a look at it. I hope we'll catch you on that video and many more to come. And meanwhile, all of you be well.